collecting gil ever became a problem, a little-known Japanese game company named Square was having financial troubles of its own. In 1987, they began facing off against another worldly evil known as bankruptcy. After only a few years of development by itself, and under the Disc Original Group collaboration, Square's bottom line was rocked by a string of unsuccessful titles, including The Death Trap, Cruise Chaser Blasty, Alpha, King's Knight, and an alien side-scrolling shooter. Even North American hits like Rad Racer and 3D World Runner were barely enough to keep the company afloat. With the resources for one last effort, Square's Director of Planning and Development, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was given the terrifying task of making a game that could save Square's dwindling future in the industry. When asked what type of game he would like to make, he replied, "I don't think I have what it takes to make a good action game. I think I'm better at telling a story." Taking cues from other RPGs on the market, from Japanese contemporaries like Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda, to stateside influences like Ultima, Sakaguchi dreamt up a video game with an immense world map to explore and an engaging tale to tell. Convinced the Famicom RPG would be his swan song, he ironically named it Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was released for the Famicom on December 18, 1987, just 2 days before Sega's Phantasy Star. It was directed by Sakaguchi himself, with character designs by rising manga artist Yoshitaka Amano, and music by Nobuo Uematsu, a veteran video game composer who lent to the project his 16th video game score. It told the story of the 4 warriors of light, bearers of ancient elemental artifacts, and heroes destined to save the land from a growing plague. Despite crystals eventually becoming the central theme of the sprite-based Final Fantasies, the original quest involved retrieving 4 orbs. The only crystal mentioned in the English version was the wizard Matoya's missing eye. The plot sent the 4 light warriors to hunt down the 4 fiends, demons responsible for plunging the world into darkness. This led them to Lich in the Cavern of Earth, Keri in the Gurgu Volcano, Kraken in the Sea Shrine, and Tiamat, high above the Mirage Tower in the floating Sky Castle. But defeating these enemies only revealed a greater threat. They had collectively created the demon Chaos out of the corpse of Garland, the first boss you faced, and sent it back in time. After your team rewound the clock to face him, you learned that Chaos was the one responsible for sending the 4 fiends into the future, creating a cataclysmic and confusing paradox. Once Chaos was crushed, the world righted itself, and the heroes returned home. The story was epic for its time, but far from the gripping, dramatized narratives the series would eventually become known for. Instead, the focus was more on creating a deep, fulfilling, and highly customizable RPG gaming experience. You could name your characters, but with only 4 spaces available, you were essentially playing out one of 6 different archetypes: White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, Thief, Fighter, which later became Warrior, and Black Belt, which later became Monk, allowing for 30 possible group combinations. Your characters battled for money and experience points, powering up to a max level of 50. After a trip through the Castle of Ordeals and a visit to the Dragon King Bahamut, players could graduate their characters to superior jobs, including White Wizard, Black Wizard, Red Wizard, Ninja, Knight, and Master. These optional class upgrades were a first for the genre, and allowed the use of advanced spells and items. The majority of Dragon Quest and Ultima encounters were one-on-one, but in Final Fantasy, you could unexpectedly face off against up to 9 varied enemy types. These encounters were random, whether you accidentally stumbled across a band of wily imps or intentionally stepped forth to retrieve a sacred treasure. Most RPGs displayed their combat engine in first person, but Final Fantasy was the first game to show the heroes on the right side of the screen opposite their opponents on the left. That way you could visibly see who is attacking who on both sides. Primitive as they may appear now, Final Fantasy's battle animations were some of the most advanced graphical effects gamers had ever seen before. There were 8 levels of either black or white magic to learn, with 4 spells available within each. Mages could only learn 3 spells per level, forcing you to choose carefully. In an awkward time before mana or magic points, spells could only be cast if they had charges available. There were no ethers or elixirs, and only houses and inns restored charges. To see the world, players had to traverse an overworld map of 3 large continents, stopping to explore a multi-level dungeon, castle, cave, or rest at a friendly town's inn and shop at its stores. The planet-wide expedition became easier to manage once your party came in control of a boat, a canoe, and eventually an airship. The flying machine granted you complete access to the map without random enemy encounters, provided you could find suitable terrain to land on. The canoe and boat were both open to surprise attacks, but holding A and pressing B several times while out in the open sea started a 15-block minigame that rewarded you with a little extra cash. Final Fantasy had an extensive musical score for its day, with almost 20 different tracks playing out over the course of the game. Several of these would go on to become mainstays in the series, including the title screen arpeggio, the victory fanfare at the end of each battle, and the opening theme, which would evolve into an anthem for the entire franchise. Final Fantasy was not an easy game. You could only save in inns or by using houses, and doing so didn't remove status effects like poison. Fallen allies could only be revived with the White Mage life spell, or by using heart-shaped clinics, which were cross-shaped churches in the Japanese version. Enemies didn't drop items, and some of the later spells became insanely expensive. And then there were ineffective attacks, meaning if one of your party members killed an enemy before the others got a chance to take a shot at him, their moves, or even their magical charges, would be wasted. The monsters would also jump from being a walk in the park to a virtually impossible deathmatch at a moment's notice, and Square would tweak each upcoming sequel in an attempt to balance the overall difficulty level. Fans were willing to put up with the punishment though, because Final Fantasy became one of the most popular RPGs of the 80s, and one of the most successful titles on the Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System. It planted a seed that flourished into a lucrative series, one that as of last year had sold more than 68 million units worldwide. Final Fantasy has been repurposed for other consoles at least 7 times, more than any other role-playing game. These include the American port in 1990 and upgrades for the MSX, WonderSwan Color, PlayStation 1, Game Boy Advance, mobile phones in Japan, and last month, the PlayStation Portable, giving credence to Sakaguchi's crew that their fantasy was anything but final. Join us next Sunday for the second chapter in our 13-part Final Fantasy retrospective. In Part 2, we'll begin our journey down an unbelievably long list of RPG titles, starting with the 2 immediate sequels that wouldn't cross the Pacific until after the end of the century. One initiated a controversial leveling system, and the other you probably just played on the DS for the first time. The growing popularity of the first Final Fantasy helped the originally unscheduled second installment arrive on Japanese store shelves 364 days later. Since Final Fantasy I was never intended to be a smash hit, its story didn't lend itself to a sequel. Because of this, Square felt the freedom to take numerous aspects of the first game in a completely new direction. Final Fantasy II was released in Japan on December 17, 1988. Sakaguchi, Amano, and Uematsu were back on board for the sequel, as well as several members from the original development team. The story began with 4 youngsters fleeing the forces of the Emperor of Palamecia, who had attacked their hometown of Fynn and killed their parents. While there was no prophecy that said they were destined to destroy evil and save their world, the heroes eventually became a humble warrior, a cautious mage, a simple-minded monk, and a morally conflicted Dark Knight. But unlike Final Fantasy I, there was no opportunity to upgrade these classes. For the first time, they were ingrained into their characters. They also didn't level up like their predecessors. Instead, the individual attributes of each character leveled up, including hit points, magic power, stamina, strength, spirit, agility, intelligence, and evasion. These categories would grow stronger the more they were used or needed, and the same was true for weapons and spells. Focusing on a character's melee or magical abilities would cause the opposite to be adversely affected, forcing players to choose one or the other. This new system was designed to create a more realistic progression formula based on cause and effect, and give the player more control over what type of weapon or brand of magic they wanted to increase in power. However, it opened up several opportunities to cheat the system and build up your characters much faster than intended. When you canceled the command you previously assigned to one of your battling sprites, the performance enhancement would still be registered. And just because you got more hit points for getting hit by the enemy, that didn't mean that your own party members couldn't fulfill that role as well. Careful and patient players could level up their party significantly in just one battle, by attacking one another or reissuing multiple commands. The walls that blocked your party from the on-screen enemies came crumbling down to create a wide-open combat window with all the necessary information at the bottom. This housed current and max HP, which could now be raised well over 999 points. Final Fantasy II also fashioned a new style of questing and story progression, which involved memorizing key terms from NPC dialogues that would be brought up in later conversations. It was a process that involved lots of unpredictable inspection and time-consuming bouts of trial and error going through the conversation trees. Mechanical and heavily scripted as it may have been, this new way of playing introduced a higher degree of hands-on interactivity that allowed players to be socially immersed in the game's world. The fresh but flawed experience method and question-answer plot progression were just two of many additions to the sequel. While these didn't return in later games, the following developments became standards within the franchise. Final Fantasy II was the first time you could fight with less than 4 members in your party, and have characters come and go throughout the story, including the White Wizard Minwu, the passive General Gordon, the family man/pugilist Joseph, the spunky pirate Leela, and the wyvern-wielding Ricard, the Last Dragoon. Boat and airship rides began on a predetermined path, until you were able to control each craft by yourself, and you were no longer required to dock boats at harbors to reach the mainland. Added to the fleet in the second game was the Snowmobile, a 3-wheeled sailing vessel that allowed you to cross an epic mass of ice. If they were lucky enough, players could stumble upon a stable hidden in a forest, housing a familiar Final Fantasy staple, the Chocobo. It was Final Fantasy II that introduced the world to these beaked companions that helped players cross the continent faster with 0 enemy encounters. And you couldn't get in an airship in 2 until you met Cid for the first time. Players would bump into this pilot/scientist/engineer/explorer many times in the years to come, as his namesake continued throughout the main series and beyond. Cid taxied you around the map and eventually gave you his pride and joy to use at your leisure. Final Fantasy II's story was much more involved than the tale that was told before it. The characters had preset relationships, and several heroes passed on or blinked away, sacrificing themselves for the greater good. In total, 6 good guys died before the story was over. The plot strangely mirrored that of Star Wars Episode IV, involving young heroes joining a rebellion. The Empire imposed its will using a giant metal ship, with a distraught princess tucked inside. Final Fantasy II almost made its way to the States in 1990 under the subtitle Dark Shadow over Palakia, but it was cancelled due to development time and the release of the Super Nintendo. US audiences would have to wait until 2003 to play Final Fantasy II when it was reinvented, along with its predecessor, for consoles, handhelds, and mobile phones around the world. Final Fantasy II was the first sequel in the industry not to feature any characters or locations from the game that preceded it. It turned the unexpected RPG series into a bona fide franchise, and left Japanese gamers waiting for 16 months to play the next sequel. American gamers didn't get to play it until last year. Final Fantasy III was released in Japan on April 27, 1990, and was once again forged by the team that created the series. It began with an earthquake opening up a hidden cavern entrance on a floating island near the village of Ur. 4 orphaned youngsters disguised as Onion Knights left their guardian in search of the Altar Cave. Within it, they discovered the Wind Crystal. The crystal bestowed upon them jobs, a Final Fantasy tradition. Instead of choosing one class or having the story do it for you, FF3 let you switch between multiple professions, including newcomers Archer, Scholar, Geomancer, Viking, Magic Knight, Bard, and Sage. All carried specific weapons and armor, and more were unlocked when each new crystal was found. Each job had its own special skill, and Final Fantasy III opened up a new space in your battle menu to include it. This gave thieves the ability to steal, and dragoons the opportunity to jump. But no matter the job, they all leveled up the same way, as the experience point system returned from the first game. 2 of the more significant new jobs were Conjurer and Summoner. Both of them were able to bring forth magical beings for the first time in the series. These summons, like Odin, Ramu, Shiva, Ifrit, Titan, and Leviathan, could be purchased in stores or obtained by defeating the powerful creatures themselves. They played no role in the actual storyline, but their additional firepower was definitely welcome. Just as the second chapter introduced chocobos, the third forced you to meet Moogles, cute, fuzzy little bat-winged bear monsters that guarded the reclusive wizard Doga. The Moogle would become a series staple, selling you magic, fighting alongside your party, and keeping your online house in order. To lighten up the early game's inventory limitations, 3 fed their bird runners a little too much grain and produced fat chocobos, plump creatures that could swallow items and transport heavy loads across the map. A submarine and several new types of airships were introduced in 3, including the Nautilus, Enterprise, and the Invincible, a warship that could be explored like a castle, complete with shops and private quarters. Cid helped you tour the skies once again, and even followed your party around for a while once you freed him from the ghost town of Kazis. The forgetful warrior Desh hitched up with your crew after he gave you mini-magic, the ability to shrink your entire party and enter several mouse-sized areas. The story placed the 4 orphaned heroes in an eternal struggle between the forces of light and darkness. When one was disrupted, the other would call on 4 warriors to reset the fragile equilibrium. Ages ago, foolish mortals attempted to absorb the power of light, calling forth dark warriors to fight back. The Gulgans, a circle of blind prophets, predicted that one day the reverse would occur, and these light warriors would hopefully restore the balance for good. These events came to pass thanks to a spiteful mage named Zand, a pupil of the wizard Noah, and a sentient being called the Cloud of Darkness, a hive mind of evil that aimed to tip the world off kilter while an unstoppable void consumed it. Final Fantasy III was unfortunately shadowed by the release of 6 in America 4 years later. The 6th installment was renamed 3 as it was the 3rd Final Fantasy released in the US. This almost erased all knowledge in the States of the 3rd Famicom game, and meant we wouldn't get our hands on it until it was ported to the Nintendo DS 16 years later. The 3rd Final Fantasy was a huge adventure, definitely the biggest RPG Square had made so far. It brought the most successful elements of the first 2 games together, and helped build a growing curiosity as the series would soon have to move ahead a generation. But before it made the jump, it met another proud landmark in its 20-year history. On July 12, 1990, 2 months after Final Fantasy III came out in Japan, the original Fantasy was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System in America, and a legion of English-speaking gamers boarded an airship ride into the future of role-playing. Join us next week for the 3rd installment in our 13-part Final Fantasy retrospective. In Part 3, we'll continue on to the next 2 games in the series that premiered the active time battle system and ability points, and began an unforgettable 16-bit trilogy on the Super Famicom. The Mega Drive was released in Japan on October 29, 1988. This was 2 months before Final Fantasy II was released in Japan, and 2 years before most Americans would know the series even existed. 16-bit adventures for Sega's new system, like Phantasy Star 2 and Sword of Vermilion, made NES owners think about the future. The Super Famicom didn't arrive in Japan until November 11th, 1990. It handled thousands of colors, dozens of sprites on screen, and 8 channels of sampled sound in full stereo. Backgrounds came to life thanks to Mode 7, which allowed layers to be scaled and rotated. It also supported 4 MB storage units, so anyone inclined to make a role-playing game with this technology could potentially squeeze 40 to 50 hours of gameplay into one plastic cartridge. The Super versions of the NES and Famicom hit the market running thanks to their epic fanbase and solid relationships with third-party developers, including Square. A fourth fantasy was inevitable. Final Fantasy IV was released in Japan on July 19, 1991. For the first time, it also came out in America the same year. It was renamed Final Fantasy II in the States, and with most US gamers absent-mindedly skipping over 2 entries in the franchise, it was considered a phenomenal leap forward. 4 was once again directed by Sakaguchi, designed by Amano, and composed by Uematsu. Final Fantasy IV had a unique protagonist, straying from the series' tendency to place massive burdens on heroes with little to no combat experience. 4's heavily conflicted leading man was Cecil, a Dark Knight of the Kingdom of Baron and commander of the Monarchy's airship fleet called the Red Wings. After questioning the king's request to attack innocent people in the search of 4 crystals, Cecil was stripped of his rank and forced to reevaluate his ambitions. He was aided on his path of redemption by his dragoon companion Kain, his white mage lover Rosa, the lost summoner Rydia, and many others. Final Fantasy IV removed the interchangeable job system from the previous game to focus on the characters, similar to the plot-driven party swapping from 2. Jobs were already assigned and oftentimes related to the plot. Spells and summons were now learned by levels, through specific battle criteria or in accordance with the story. You never knew what crew you were going to end up with, but the arrangements were given a boost by allowing an extra character, making the battle line built for 5, for the first and only time. Telepathic hypnosis played a big factor in characters leaving your group. Once Cecil had left his kingdom behind, the warrior Golbez took control of the Red Wings and the will of Kain. The karate master Yang also briefly fell victim to mind manipulation, and both of your friends had to be smacked around before they eventually snapped out of it. These additional characters didn't just follow, they fought, and sometimes died alongside you. Your ranks gained the abilities of Tella, the vengeful mage, Edward, the pensive bard, Palom and Porum, a precocious pair of young mages, Edge, an impulsive prince, and Fusoya, a resident of the moon with many buried secrets to tell. Even the tinkerer Cid grabbed a club and finally took matters into his own hands. It's also worth noting that Rydia is one of the only characters in the entire franchise that goes through a permanent physical transformation. She left your party unexpectedly and resurfaced in the Land of Summons, where time moved faster. She dropped her ability to perform white magic, but gained several new spells, her full summoning potential, and a matured character sprite. 4's biggest technical influence on the rest of the series was the introduction of the active time battle system created by Hiroyuki Ito. With it, adversaries don't wait patiently for players to input actions. Instead, each enemy and character gets a turn every few seconds, with players forced to act quickly if they want to finish the battle with minimal damage. The system made combat a bit livelier, allowing for more engrossing gameplay. The battle screens added unique terrain layouts underneath their heroes and enemies. The environments, characters, monsters, and bosses all received a significant improvement in detail. Group spells all animated at the same time. Smoke and fog was now transparent. Square clearly proved that Final Fantasy IV could not have been done on the 8-bit Nintendo. You could even adjust the color of the menus. While previous fantasies typically had just the planet's surface to explore, 4 added 2 free-roaming maps, the Underworld and the surface of the Moon. Your flying machines were fashioned with accessories to help you get to these new places. The Lunar Whale was resurrected to help you reach the stars, and black chocobos were introduced that could fly but only land in forests. All of Nobuo Uematsu's scores have been exceptional for their era, but Final Fantasy IV was the first noticeable example of the melodic subtleties and enduring themes that his work has gradually become famous for. Theme of Love has been taught to Japanese school children as part of their curriculum. The tracks from 4 have appeared on several compilation albums and have been performed live by numerous orchestras and metal bands.
The story in 4 rekindled the 4-tier elemental structure, and even referred to the monsters as fiends. Mylon, Kainazo, Valvalis, and Rubicant weren't the original names, but their inclusion was a nod to the first game. Summons were also given peculiar names, as 4 first introduced Americans to the advanced magic. Shiva, Odin, and Bahamut kept their names throughout the series, but Americans first knew Ifrit and Ramu as Jinn and Indra. One of the towns in 4 began a Final Fantasy tradition of names reappearing in later games, as Mysidia, originally from Final Fantasy II, returns as a homey mage village. 4 made several direct references to our universe as well. It was the first fantasy to name its world, as Fusoya refers to it as the Blue Planet. He explains that he and the rest of his race, called the Lunarians, originally came from a planet in between Mars and Jupiter. Fusoya also revealed that Golbez was not their ultimate enemy, as he was also being brainwashed by another Lunarian named Zemus. Eventually, Zemus revealed his true form, but with the help of some well wishes from home, Cecil and company found the strength to overcome the overgrown evil. 4 was the first Final Fantasy and one of the first RPGs to have multiple characters with their own deep, intertwining stories and affecting relationships. It was the first to link 2 heroes together romantically, a device the later Final Fantasies would hinge entire plotlines on. Some criticisms were raised regarding the spotty English translation, but even those little quirks are recalled with fond memories by longtime fans. The script and the graphics would be continually revised as 4 was ported to the PlayStation, WonderSwan Color, and Game Boy Advance, and it's scheduled to be released in 3D on the Nintendo DS sometime before the end of 2007. 4 has sold close to 3 million copies across all its systems, but it was not an immediate hit. Whether it was because of 4's international sales numbers, Nintendo's tentative relationship with Square, or the time and resource-consuming task of translating one massive game after another, the next title was for the 3rd time in the franchise, only released in Japan. Despite thousands of American gamers suddenly discovering the role-playing series, the 5th installment wouldn't make it to US shores until the end of the decade. Final Fantasy V was released on December 6, 1992. The now infamous creative team returned for the 5th time, and Tetsuya Nomura was added to the group as a monster designer. Nomura would go on to design the characters for 7, 8, 10, 10-2, and direct Advent Children. 5's opening broke the mold by having the 4 main characters meet each other for the very first time. Born to be a wanderer, the hero Bartz sees a meteor fall while camping out with his chocobo, Boko, and the two run to the site of the crash. There, they met Lena, the Princess of Tycoon, and Galuf, one of the oldest central characters in any Final Fantasy, whose memory was recently knocked out of his mind. Crystals returned as the core theme of the story, but this time they directly affected the world around them, other than just threatening to destroy it. When the wind crystal shattered, the wind stopped blowing, making it nearly impossible to travel by sea, and so on. The quest set you in search of the whereabouts of King Tycoon, the identity of Galuf, and the evil behind it all. 5 returned to the multiple job structure from 3, but with a new refined system, also created by Hiroyuki Ito. Ability points were gained once you received your first handful of jobs, so you leveled your jobs and characters separately. When each new level was reached, you got a new ability, and you could then assign one as a sub-ability to another job. This was the series' first attempt at multi-classing. The brand new classes including Blue Mage, Berserker, Sorcerer, Time Mage, Trainer, Samurai, Dancer, Chemist, and Mime created even more advanced abilities that would reappear in the sequels to come. Blue Mages brought their enemy skill-based power to the party. Samurais tossed Gil, and Mimes could mimic the commands of others as well as assign up to 3 sub-abilities. Thieves could now dash, a time-saving talent that would be added automatically to the ports by pressing the B button. Multi-classing was highly functional, but it was also rewarding because it offered you the chance to change your physical appearance at will for the first time in the franchise. There were a total of 110 different costumes, as each character looked different when they assumed each job. Cid helped you get back above the clouds, but this time he was assisted by his grandson Mid. The two busy workers turned your airship into a 3-part flying machine, boat, and submarine to glide across all 3 planes of the planet. But their planet wasn't the only one they explored. Their primary adversary, X-Death, revealed himself shortly before Galuf began to recall his memories. Galuf remembered he was in fact royalty from another world, and had a granddaughter named Chrystal. When X-Death was first released, Galuf was one of the 4 original Warriors of Dawn that stood up to oppose him. One of X-Death's henchmen, Gilgamesh, made his first Final Fantasy cameo in 5, and would return as a flamboyant adventurer in the 2D and 3D journeys to follow. X-Death's aim was to harness a void locked inside the rift between the 2 worlds that was created when they were magically ripped apart. To force the 2 dimensions together, he stole 4 crystals from a sacred tree, keeping the balance in place. And it seemed all hope was lost for the new Warriors of Dawn. It was then that Galuf made it to his feet and made franchise history. Before Eris, Galuf was the first long-term party member to die in the line of duty. The loss was a shock, considering you were well over halfway through the story, but all your hard work spent honing his abilities didn't go to waste. Galuf transferred all he knew to Chrystal, and she filled his space in the battle queue. A visit to the Turtle Sage Guild revealed the existence of 12 legendary weapons, sacred items destined for the jobs they were created for. With these tools in tow, the newly assembled foursome crossed into the rift and faced X-Death right as he merged with the void itself. For the first time, there were multiple endings triggered by whoever was or wasn't standing in your party when X-Death's final form was defeated. Final Fantasy V was supposed to be Final Fantasy III in America, but the first localization was cancelled. It was then rumored to be released as Final Fantasy Extreme, but plans for that project also fell through. Even a 3rd attempt was launched and crushed to bring 5 to PCs by developer Top Dog Software. These failed attempts aggravated gamers so much, 5 became one of the first titles to receive a fan translation, and until 1998, they were the only ways you could play it. Eventually 5 re-emerged on the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance with updated cinemas and new jobs to try on. It was then that American gamers could finally experience the intricate job system that would leave undeniable traces on the rest of the franchise. Join us next week as we celebrate 6 generations of sprite-based storytelling. We'll look back at the fascinating evolution of these pixel-perfect heroes that continually elevated the bit role-playing era to new heights, and thoroughly examine one of the finest stories the series has ever told. How do you animate something 26 pixels tall? How can a character with barely enough room to blink exude emotion? From the tight restrictions on how many sprites could fill the screen to how much text could fit in each blue rectangular bubble, there were multiple challenges that Square was faced with when developing the first 6 Final Fantasies. The original Famicom battle sprites were 26 pixels in height, had only 4 different colors to compose their blocky likeness, and 6 different frames of animation. The Super Famicom characters were a few pixels smaller, but flaunted 11 different colors that drastically improved their individual wardrobe options, and performed up to 40 unique frames of animation, conveying feelings of sadness, anger, doubt, surprise, and joy. In Final Fantasy I, characters would roam aimlessly around each town, or stand and wait for you to engage them in conversation. Whenever additional movement was implied, they would vanish. In Final Fantasy II, characters began to walk along scripted paths, oftentimes when entering or exiting a room. This scene from 2, where Paul rescues your party from imprisonment, is one of the first clear examples of Square trying out comical sprite choreography. These scenarios would become much more elaborate, often involving the tiny actors jumping and throwing themselves around when the paltry 30 pixels used to create their faces couldn't communicate their excitement or frustration. It was this careful attention to expression that made the personalities in each Final Fantasy so charming, and the events so surprisingly engaging. In the first 5 games, there were separate sprites for the models in combat and on the overworld, a smaller one on the map and a larger, more detailed one in battle. But the 6th chapter in Final Fantasy used the higher resolution hero for both, adding about 10 different animations per character. Even minor movements like the wink of an eye or the wag of a finger drew layers of subtle inflections onto each scene. Best of all, the multiple NPCs you encountered grew up in stature as well. By the mid-90s, Square was ready to showcase the aptitude of their tiny thespians in one final 16-bit performance. Final Fantasy VI was released in Japan on April 2, 1994, and in America the following October. It showed up in the States as Final Fantasy III, and was the last title to be renumbered as it crossed shores. Yoshitaka Amano continued his work as the series' character designer, and Nobuo Uematsu wrote his most extensive score yet for the 6th installment. For the first time, Hironobu Sakaguchi did not direct, but produced the game and developed the concept. His former duties were split between series innovator Hiroyuki Ito and designer and writer Yoshinori Kitase. Kitase had worked with Squaresoft on Romancing Saga and the Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy, but 6 was his directorial debut. He would go on to direct Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy VIII. 6 opened with an unnamed soldier who is still the only focal female protagonist to begin a Final Fantasy game. Her name was Terra, and that was about all she could remember. Hunted by yet another oppressive tyrannical government and possessing forbidden magical powers she could not comprehend, Terra sought refuge with the Returners, a renegade group secretly gathering their forces for an attack against Emperor Gestal. 1,000 years prior, a conflict called the War of the Magi almost destroyed the world, and society struggled to regain technology. The fight began when humans were tempted to harness the power of mystical beings called Espers, and it appeared the Empire was after the same goal, moving dangerously close to repeating another senseless and deadly mistake. Espers were the first names clearly bestowed upon summons, and a third ingenious system created by Hiroyuki Ito. Humans could only learn their power when the beasts expired into crystallized forms called magicite. Similar to the ability points from 5, winning battles in 6 awarded characters with magic points. When an Esper was assigned to one of your characters, these points would be added to the spells that Esper could teach you, and you would learn them at the percentage rate indicated. Some taught spells faster than others, and some taught just one exclusively. This meant that anyone could learn any spell, and use them at any time. The Empire's savage lust for the Esper's power, which forced the creatures into exile, combined with sacrificing their lives to assist you in your journey, gave summons a more important role in the central quest than ever before. The other element that contributed to the epic story was the astounding number of playable characters. 6 didn't let you assign jobs, just as 4 had removed the prior class system to concentrate on a series of elaborate plotlines. While 5 had 22 jobs, 6 eventually offered 14 characters you could swap out any time to create your own party. Occasionally, the story filled in a few necessary spaces for certain scenes, but most of the time, all 4 roles were yours to cast. Your warriors could be customized even further by equipping up to 2 relics, trinkets that awarded various bonuses similar to the sub-abilities from 5. All this party customization made you that much more attached to whoever you chose each time the order opened up. At 2 points throughout the narrative, you were required to split up your available forces into 3 parties and command them all simultaneously against several meandering enemy groups. If one of them got past you to your end zone of the battlefield, the skirmish would be lost. In 2 certain dungeons, including the one that leads to the finale, you had to direct separate groups working back and forth to assist one another. And at one pivotal junction, the story split you into 3 teams with alternate destinations, and you got to choose your own adventure. The Returners' front lines were made up of Locke, a thief, Edgar, the young king of Figaro, Sabin, his twin brother, Celes, a former Imperial general, Setzer, a gambler and airship pilot, Cyan, a tortured warrior, Gao, a lost feral child, Strago, an elder mage knight, Realm, his rambunctious granddaughter, and Shadow, a ninja with a foggy past that's never completely revealed. Each character had its own signature talent and piece of the plot puzzle. Edgar used tools. Sabin performed Street Fighter-style button commands called blitzes. Celes wielded a runic blade that absorbed magical attacks. Cyan counted upwards through different sword skills. Gao imitated monsters. Setzer pulled a lever on an attack-initiating slot machine, and so on. At least one segment of the game was devoted to revealing fragments from each of the characters' backstories, and some of them were more thought-provoking and heartbreaking than the events that made up the main mission. The only returners that were primed solely for battle, aside from cameos that would drop in and out of your party, were 3 optional recruits near the end of the game: the Moogle Mog, the Yeti Umaro, and the mysterious mimic Gogo, who also made a shrouded appearance in Final Fantasy V. Cid stayed out of the party in 6, merely helping you when he could. As a scientist in the Empire's Magitech facility, he had nothing to do with airships for the first time. All of these leading players were almost overshadowed by one of the gaudiest villains the series has ever feared. Kefka, Emperor Gestal's ambassador, was a nasty clown that demanded a great deal of attention. He was among the first faces to appear on the screen, and the first character to utter a spoken line of dialogue, even if it was just a trademark cackle. Kefka was not a supernatural being, or the collected sum of all evil, or a mind-warping god from another planet. He was a man, albeit a twisted soul, who sought supreme power above all else. He wasn't a puppet to a higher power, or a victim seeking revenge. He was just an awful human being, and a wonderful bad guy. But creating the characters wasn't enough. They acted and animated in ways the series had never attempted before. The fourth wall of the battle screen was obliterated, with interactive scenes often playing themselves out from the combat view. Instances where multiple characters were animated at once were now commonplace, instead of being reserved for towns or major plot moments. The best example of this, and the scene that stole the show, quite literally in 6, was an opera the player had to actively participate in by remembering their lines and blocking. This story within a story within a story shows how elegantly each event played out in 6, and why most of its moments are eternally unforgettable. With Cid working for the Empire, the high roller Setzer allowed you to borrow the only airship in the world. When that craft crashed and burned, he dug up another that belonged to a lost friend. You could be taxied by boat on occasion, but there were no canoes, snowmobiles, or submarines in 6, just the 2 flying machines. But your point of view while controlling them was drastically different. Instead of being stuck to one altitude and forced to travel in 4 directions, you had 360 degrees of movement, along with the ability to climb and dive through the air. A brand new mini-map in the lower right kept you from getting lost, which was easy to do with the extreme speeds of the new crafts. This new beveled angle was also applied to chocobo runs, which showed your character on birdback from a lowered perspective. The Second War of the Magi led both sides to the Sealed Gate, the border between their world and the land the Espers had originally escaped to. Coming in contact with their kind revealed that Terra was neither an Esper nor a human, but a product of both. Proof that the 2 races could coexist, she rallied the returners until they were forced to stop Kefka from disturbing 3 statues that created magic itself ages ago. But they were too late. Forced to flee the unnatural floating island, they boarded their airship just in time to see it torn in 2. The entire army was scattered, their fates unknown, and the planet was changed forever. Waking up in the shoes of Celes, on the shores of a deserted island, players had to explore this brand new planet of scorched earth, reassemble their ranks soldier by soldier, and reach a looming tower for the game's final confrontation. At SIGGRAPH in 1995, Locke, Terra, and Shadow made a command performance in a 3D minigame created by Square, using prototype Nintendo 64 workstations from Silicon Graphics. The technical demonstration was completely playable, with patterns made by a computer mouse initiating attack commands. It served to teach Square's artists how to render sprites in 3D, and show the eager public what they had in store for the first 3D Final Fantasy. FF6 was also ported to the PlayStation in 1999 and the Game Boy Advance in early 2007. Final Fantasy VI was an extraordinary way for the series to bow out of the second dimension. Its artfully crafted storyline and meaningful characters made the final chapter in the Nintendo saga feel as if all the other adventures had been building up to its creation. Its 20-minute ending is one of the longest on the platform, and as the last page in its book was turned, it was clear that 6 would be one tough fantasy to follow. From the way it capitalized on the full potential of the Super Nintendo to the acclaim it received, Final Fantasy VI's visual flair primed the series for the generation to follow, and it would never have to hide its true Roman numerals again. Join us next week when we explore the Final Fantasy game that needs no introduction. It was the first use of full-motion video, a spectacular shift into the third dimension, and one of the most intense role-playing obsessions of all time. Development for the seventh Final Fantasy began in 1995, 1 year after the release of 6. Square had been experimenting with the idea of a 3D RPG ever since 5 was released on the Super Famicom, and the demo at SIGGRAPH showed Square could shift its style forward a dimension. It just didn't reveal how. Nintendo's next-generation machine would be cartridge-based, and while its 64-bit system would be the most powerful on the market, cartridges with a great deal of memory were incredibly expensive to produce. Looking at its finances and the concepts it was cooking for the next Final Fantasy, Square was forced to make a difficult decision. Saying goodbye to their sprites, and Nintendo, which had provided 2 generations of hardware for Square to revive itself with, the company announced on January 12, 1996, the series would continue exclusively on the Sony PlayStation. Square wouldn't release another game for a Nintendo console until Crystal Chronicles for the GameCube, 7 years later. The team Square assembled to tackle the project was 100 strong, one of the largest ever devoted to a single game's development. They had a budget of $45 million and cutting-edge film production tools like Power Animator and Softimage 3D. Sony launched a $100 million advertising campaign to bring anticipation to a boil. Due to its extraordinary goals, the game's release date was pushed back almost a full year. On a new console with new technology and a concept that was a far cry from the themes its fans had grown to love, Square wasn't too far from where it had been almost 10 years earlier. Its next game would either boost it to superstardom or summon the imminent doom of the company. Final Fantasy VII was released in Japan on January 31st, 1997, and American gamers had to go on hearing how amazing it was for another 9 months. Hironobu Sakaguchi remained at the helm, maintaining a lead production role. Yoshinori Kitase continued on from 6 to direct, and series veterans Yoshitaka Amano and Nobuo Uematsu returned to their usual duties. Kazushige Nojima assisted Sakaguchi and Kitase with the writing, and Tetsuya Nomura, who joined the team for 5, designed the characters for the first time. His manga style was deemed more compatible with the basic 3D structure of the game. While previous fantasies had you gradually enlist in forces struggling to save the world, 7 rushed you right into battle with a resistance group on a mission to destroy a toxic reactor. The self-absorbed swordsman Cloud Strife initially had little interest in joining the rebels, but if the pay was right, he was willing to hang around. A monopolizing megacorporation called the Shinra Electric Power Company was slowly sucking the life out of the planet, and freedom fighters known as Avalanche were the only ones willing to fight back. As an ex-member of Soldier, Shinra's squad of genetically enhanced elite warriors, Cloud was stuck fighting for the good guys whether he liked it or not. He was asked to sign up by his childhood friend Tifa, and bossed around by its outspoken leader Barrett. The small resistance army would grow to include the wild experiment Red 13, the bubbly thief Yuffie, the feline puppet Kate Sith, the shadowy gunfighter Vincent, and after rescuing her from Shinra headquarters, the spiritually serene Eris. For the most part, the game shared a point of view similar to PlayStation predecessor Resident Evil. There was a fixed camera and pre-rendered backgrounds. Polygonal characters moved where the environment would let them. One of Sakaguchi's main concerns with continuity was the moments between these scenes. In an attempt to cover loading times, many animations or short in-game cinemas were implemented. This began the time-honored tradition of the Final Fantasy in-game cutscene. Final Fantasy VII employed over 40 minutes of full-motion wonder, the most impressive use of video as a gaming tool for its time. In addition, there were a number of cinematic transitions which used the same models and backgrounds in the game that seamlessly blended them into the action. The battle window also gained cinematic enhancements. The camera was almost constantly moving, highlighting magic spells, special abilities, and enemy attacks. These smooth perspective patterns were also random, ensuring you rarely saw the same angle twice in one fight. The sequences that did repeat were the elaborate summons. Some of them were close to a minute in length. Your party size was cut down to 3, forcing you to simplify your attack strategies. You also only had 3 items to equip in your inventory: a weapon, armor, and an accessory. This appeared quite restrictive at first, until Barrett revealed the game's ability system, called Materia. These colorful orbs were formed out of crystallized Mako, the blood pumping in the planet's veins, called the life stream, and the source of the world's power. Possessing a piece of materia made you spiritually linked to the planet's spirit, and the memories of those who had returned to its source after death. This connection gave you numerous spells and bonuses, similar to espers and relics combined. But you didn't learn these skills, each materia did, and when you swapped their assignments, the experience level traveled with them. Materia leveled on ability points after each battle, and characters got more materia slots as their weapons and armor improved. Job-specific battle behaviors like covering, stealing, and casting spells on multiple targets were now assigned to specific materia. Along with being spiritual power generators, the orbs gave you stat bonuses reflective of their abilities. Like espers, materia also played a major role in the story, as white and black materia became pivotal to the balance of the planet. Black materia cast Meteor, to which the only defense was Holy, which required white materia. Both these spells had made prior appearances in Final Fantasy, but never had they affected the world so significantly. When your party was pushed to the brink, a new bar began flashing next to their active time battle indicator. When they received damage, it filled up, and at its peak, the attack option was replaced with character-specific limit breaks. You couldn't choose from the whole list, though, and had to assign which of the 4 groups to bring into the fray. You could unleash them the second they were earned, or save them for another battle. Cid hopped back in the pilot seat in 7 as an aggressive aeronaut with dreams of traveling into outer space. His attitude and style was reminiscent of the character's first appearance in 2, and a departure from the older bearded design gamers had met in 3, 4, and 5. He donated the tiny Bronco, a small craft that doubled as a boat after it was shot down. He also welcomed you aboard his Lady Luck, the High Wind, which shared his last name. He took up a lance and aided you in battle for the second time in the series, sharing his pedigree and many abilities with the Dragoon Cain from Final Fantasy IV. Chocobos chirped you across the landscape, but you had to call them by equipping the Chocobo lure materia to bring them into battle. You could then race your newfound pets by entering them in speedways at the Golden Saucer. After you won your first Choco chase, the manager Dio gave you a land-roving buggy that was open to enemy attacks, but chugged over rivers and deserts. The Saucer was like Pleasure Island, with several interactive minigames requiring dexterous button selecting. These time trials also emerged in the story, making pivotal moments tense with the fear of getting one step behind. They also ensured the following games would have an equal amount or more of playful diversions that could absorb your time when you weren't worrying about the end of the world. 7 dealt with surprisingly mature subject matter, from an inclusion of cross-dressing as a mission objective to an open reference to prostitution. Barrett was the first leader bold enough to utter several obscenities, and the only central black character in the entire franchise. It was also the first entry to show blood. They say the mettle of a man is tested in adversities, and anyone who would dare stand against Sephiroth would find out immediately what they were made of. Therefore, it's ironic that Cloud didn't realize who he really was. Sephiroth was the strongest soldier alive, but wouldn't rest until he controlled the planet. He sought to bring Meteor down to the surface, tearing a wound so deep that the life stream would emerge to cleanse it. There, he would join with it, becoming a god with the planet's pulse at his fingertips. Eris also rediscovered her identity as a direct descendant of the Cetra, or Ancients, a race that nearly vanished thousands of years ago. They were run off their homeworld by Genova, a vampiric alien lifeform that crash-landed in a meteor long before anyone could remember. Cloud's feelings were split between Eris and longtime pal Tifa, as the story had two female leads seeking affections for the first time. You could choose who to court and who to ignore, but it wouldn't matter. At GDC in 2004, Steven Spielberg said, "I think the real indicator that games have become a storytelling art form will be when somebody confesses that they cried at level 17. He never played Final Fantasy VII. The grand story in 7 was a compilation of a number of inspirations. With the release of Final Fantasy VI, Sakaguchi was faced with the death of his mother. Wrestling with grief led him to develop a number of the concepts in 7, such as Genova. Further depth was drawn from religious beliefs that center on rebirth, or the cycling of souls back to a great mystical body, most apparent in the Lifestream. The name Sephiroth also comes from the mythology of the Kabbalah, referring to spiritual manifestations of the 10 heavenly attributes. Final Fantasy VII was a marvel of technology and a commanding display of limitless imagination. The only thing that lessened its impact was that, were it not for Ifrit, Shiva, and Chocobo riding Moogles, the game was almost unrecognizable as a Final Fantasy title. The series went from being classically medieval to ambiguously futuristic. Castles became skyscrapers, wyverns became helicopters, minecarts became motorcycles, and bows became machine guns. While fans will eternally debate which Final Fantasy is the best, no one can argue that 7 is the most popular, or the one that left the largest stamp on the industry. It was the first Final Fantasy to be released on the PC. The snowboarding minigame was ported to mobile phones in 2005, and in 1998, Cloud, Tifa, Sephiroth, Yuffie, Vincent, and Zack all appeared as playable combatants in the fighting game Airgee's God Bless the Ring. Their inclusion led many to call the PlayStation release the Final Fantasy Fighter. Shortly after the turn of the century, Nomura and Kitase were approached to create a polymorphic project that could expand one of the Final Fantasy games across multiple mediums, in an effort to prove the franchise was capable of breaking out of its Roman numeral namesake. Kitase immediately suggested 7 as the perfect candidate, because its ending left numerous avenues open for the story to continue. The project was called Compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Its ongoing catalog includes Before Crisis, a prequel to 7 focusing on the Turks, Shinra's version of the CIA. The turn-based adventure storyline follows the Shinra investigators as they fight the precursor to the Avalanche introduced in 7. The mobile phone exclusive series ran for 25 episodes in Japan, and the last entry was released on April 1st, 2006. A PSP game was also introduced called Crisis Core, which stars 7's underappreciated hero Zack, Cloud's savior and Eris's former boyfriend. But the first video game to hit stores under the compilation umbrella came from an unexpected genre, the shooter. Combining a first-person perspective with the back-flipping melee action of Devil May Cry, the last chapter in the saga of Midgar focused on the unfinished business of Vincent Valentine. Dirge of Cerberus was released in Japan on January 26, 2006. Cerberus had Vincent facing off against an army of rogue soldiers called Deep Ground, whose intent was to call forth Omega and end the world. Every living thing eventually returned to the Lifestream, and Omega was the entity that would one day collect all the energy and return it to the stars, leaving the planet as a crumbling rock disintegrating into space. Despite Vincent's obvious ease at using Cerberus and dodging enemy fire with Flare, the gameplay in Dirge was admittedly constrictive. This was apparent due to several changes made to the game before its US release 7 months later. Dirge had a mobile add-on called Lost Episode, released on August 18, 2006. And then there's the infamous trailer shown during the Sony press conference at E3 2005 that teased millions by demonstrating what Final Fantasy VII would look like if it was recreated for the PlayStation 3. Although it was solely intended to act as a technical demonstration, many fans mistook it, and still do, as a trailer for a forthcoming rebirth of the PlayStation Classic. Even if the game never returns, the universe of Final Fantasy VII continues to expand. The fan community on both coasts has continually called out 7 as one of the best video games ever created. At a financial results conference in 2006, Square Enix president Yoichi Wada claimed the compilation of Final Fantasy VII would be around for another 10 years, which would end the celebration on its 20th anniversary. Join us next week for another installment in our 13-part Final Fantasy retrospective. In Part 6, we'll highlight the other releases on the PlayStation, 2 sequels that are the best examples of how drastically different a pair of Final Fantasy games can be. One attempted to raise its characters up to tell a feature-length love story, and the other brought the franchise back to its forgotten roots. Squaresoft's foray into the CD-based era was a veritable success. Final Fantasy VII shattered sales records on both coasts, selling an astounding 2.3 million copies within 3 days of its Japanese release, and an additional 330,000 later that year in America. For the first time ever, Final Fantasy was a mainstream fixture in the gaming world. VII's departure from the series' signature conventions was originally perceived as risque. The game skated between elements of the past and present with adventurous new changes in system mechanics and story direction. In the end, those very tweaks were paramount to VII's success. When Square knew it had a hit on its hands, the company began production on number 8 the very same year, during VII's localization in the US. The series had to evolve even further, like no other in the franchise. Final Fantasy VIII was released in Japan on February 11, 1999, September 7th in the States. Development had run continuously for nearly 2 years. Sakaguchi graced the project once more as the executive producer, while Kitase, Nomura, and Uematsu reprised their respective roles. The experience that Square gained during the production of VII bolstered its understanding of the PlayStation hardware's capabilities. With this knowledge in hand, Kitase envisioned the next game sporting a more realistic look, and with Nomura's encouragement, a school days aesthetic similar to popular Japanese dramas and animes airing at the time. With this came realistically proportioned character models, the first the series had ever seen. And the ballad of Squall Leonhardt and Rinoa Hartley. Final Fantasies typically put you in the company of rogues, rebels, and mercenaries, but 8 established players as one of the trainees of Balam Garden, a military academy managed by the watchful eye of Headmaster Cid. Squall, an introverted gunblade specialist, was one of the school's most promising students. On the day of his graduation exam, he was contracted by the state of Delay to repel the forces of the invading Galbadian Empire, along with fellow trainees Zell, a hot-headed brawler, Selphie, a cheerful nunchaku master, Cypher, a rebellious upperclassman, and Quistis, Squall's instructor. Squall's Galbadian encounter was the first of many. He eventually found himself under the commission of Rinoa, the spirited leader of an upstart rebellion group. Together, they become inextricably linked to the fate of Galbadia's leader, Sorceress Adia. A later objective called upon Squall and his unit, headlined by the romantic rifleman Irvine, to assassinate the sorceress. But when the plan goes awry, a plentitude of truths open themselves to Squall, prompting him to abandon all preconceived notions of the mission and his duty. A sorceress from the future, Ultimisia, was revealed as the true culprit, manipulating time itself in a bid to unite her dimension with the past. Together with his companions, Squall ventured into the Den of the Lion to restore order to the world and protect the ones dear to his heart. Final Fantasy VIII made bold new strokes in story and narration. The theme of love had always played a part in side stories prior, but for the first time, it was brought into the foreground as the main motivator for the protagonist's actions. It was, for all intents and purposes, a love story, with its cast of characters taking respective roles amid webs of tangled relationships. It was also the first Final Fantasy that delved into different frames of mind, from the internal narrative of Squall's thoughts to a side quest set in a completely different place and time. The realistic tone was made immediately clear by the opening score, an orchestral piece accompanied by a Latin choir and breathtaking full-motion video. Along with the game's title theme song, Eyes on Me, sung by Chinese pop star Fei Wong, 8 was the first of the series to feature lyrical scores. The boundaries that had separated Final Fantasy from other mediums of popular expression, like movies and music, had been broken. Eyes on Me later became a single that went on to sell 400,000 copies in Japan. One of Squall's first outings pitted him against the fiery Ifrit, who wasn't known as a summon or esper, but as a GF, or guardian force. When these magical beasts were bested in combat, they became permanent additions to your party that could be equipped. GFs were powerful allies you could summon in battle, but outside of combat was where they were most useful, in the form of junctioning, the central feature of 8. Rather than pulling on armor with predetermined stats, players could assign magic siphoned from enemies, an action called drawing, and equip them to specific stats and attributes. Junctioning allowed for a great deal of customization and flexibility, bequeathing players all the elemental and status effect spells of the series at their beck and call. Apart from the radical changes in magic and summons, the combat structure, for the most part, resembled the 3-man active time battles from 7. Each of the characters' limit breaks, however, shed 7's limit bar and returned to the rare desperation moves from Final Fantasy VI. Squall, like Cyan before him, pulled off a series of blade strikes timed by the R1 trigger, while Zell utilized the spiritual successor of Sabin's blitz attacks. Weapons were no longer bought, but upgraded, which took various parts collected in battle and used them in a crafting process. In addition, cars, trains, and shuttles comprised a large number of transportation options, although airships, flying fortresses, and the ubiquitous chocobo also made appearances. The chocobo was also featured in a minigame tie-in using the Pocket Station. The code to power it still exists in the North American release, but the peripheral never made it across the Pacific. One of Final Fantasy VIII's biggest side features was Triple Triad, a robust minigame that took place on a grid with numbered cards. Though not necessary, it was an interesting and rich diversion that awarded players persistent enough to play it. Determined card sharks could net Squall's legendary weapon, the Lionheart, with enough diligence. Riding the hype of its predecessor, Final Fantasy VIII's release in 1999 beat previous records set with 2.4 million copies sold in Japan, and in America, it became the best-selling game for 3 weeks after its debut in September. Critically, however, the game was received with mixed reactions. Most players and critics felt that the junctioning system was flawed and needlessly complicated, longing for the user-friendliness of 7's materia. Drawing magic from enemies was also cited as a repetitive task. Conversely, some embraced 8's bold system changes. Its storytelling remains amongst the most compelling the series has seen, and its following is one of the largest across the worldwide fanbase. Many speculated the next game in the series would go above and beyond the modern realism of 8 and into the realm of the future. It ultimately became a fond look at the past. As the last Final Fantasy on the original PlayStation, Sakaguchi wanted it to be an adequate reflection on the series thus far. The concept they would end up using wasn't originally intended to be a part of the core franchise. While its early development began alongside 8, the plan was to release the game as an addendum so as not to conflict with the newer futuristic direction the series was heading for. In 1999, it was announced that the yet untitled project would indeed receive a Roman numeral. It was slated to come out in early 2000, but Square's biggest competitor, Enix, had just finished Dragon Quest VII. Square delayed its latest efforts several months to avoid a simultaneous release. They used the time for another marketing push of action figures and Coca-Cola commercials. These showed its next Final Fantasy would be both a striking departure and a faithful homage to the 8 games that preceded it. Final Fantasy IX was released in Japan on July 7, 2000. It arrived in America in mid-November. In addition to his production role, Hironobu Sakaguchi returned to the creative staff to help solidify early concepts. He was aided by game producer Shinji Hashimoto. Yoshitaka Amano also returned to the forefront of the team. Nobuo Uematsu composed his 9th continuous score, and in the director's chair was Hiroyuki Ito, responsible for such Final Fantasy pillars as the Job and Active Time Battle Systems and Espers. Almost every aspect of the design in 9 returned to the roots of the series. The plot appeared to follow many common cliches, but it was intended to. The adventure began when our hero, Zidane, a member of a rogue theater group, took part in an elaborate attempt to kidnap the Princess Garnet. As they bumbled their way through the mission, they were accidentally joined by Garnet's stalwart protector Steiner and the befuddled black mage Vivi. Through the trials that followed, they enlisted the talents of the stoic dragoon Freya, the effervescent summoner Aiko, the enigmatic gourmand Quina, and the brooding bounty hunter Amarant. They also got occasional assistance from Beatrix, a general to the army of Alexandria, and various members of Tantalus, Zidane's performing pals. Cid got promoted to a royal position in 9 as the regent and ruler of Lindblum. He appeared to the party in Oglop form after being cursed by his wife Hilda. Cid revealed he was the one who ordered Tantalus to kidnap the princess to protect her from the unexplained actions of her mother, Queen Braun. Nier helped the party board the Blue Narcissus when both of their airships barely made it back to the ground in one piece. The team took back the skies on Cid's latest invention, the Hildegard III, and even stole the enemy's craft, the Invincible. They also traveled by air trolley and even underground spider in 2 ancient transit systems called the Gargan and Fossil Rue. The plot in 9 was not only filled with numerous references to the 2 sprite generations, it almost felt like a direct sequel to the original NES adventure. It was revealed the story's fatalistic villain Kuja came from another world called Terra. To reach this dimension and discover its secrets, you had to travel to 4 elemental shrines. Their protectors, Malorus, Tiamat, Kraken, and Lich, are unmistakable allusions to the fiends from Final Fantasy I. Even the time-traveling antagonist from the first game made a comeback, as a Darth Vader-esque Garland was unmasked as the architect of the world's demise. His dreamlike realm was called Pandemonium, which was the Emperor's end zone in Final Fantasy II. Crystals also returned, and their themes were fused with the series' first mention of Gaia as the name of the planet. 9 primarily dealt with its lead characters battling with issues of identity. Garnet had the weight of a kingdom on her inexperienced shoulders, and Vivi came to terms with his own creation and inevitable death. Even Kuja wrestles with intense feelings of powerlessness. In addition to conceptual reference, there are also many specific nods to its predecessors. Hilda bears a resemblance to the Final Fantasy II queen. Dagger dons a white mage's robe, the dwarves shout out a somewhat familiar greeting, the battle line went back to 4, and you could attempt to buy a number of classic trinkets at the Treno auction house, such as Yuna's mirror. The ability system in 9 was considerably streamlined in comparison to the complexities of 8, and reflected the systems Ito had previously implemented. Much like with Espers, characters in 9 learned their abilities by equipping some sort of item that accrued ability points per battle. Once the skills were learned, the item could be swapped out and the character would still be able to use the ability. Any equipment slot now had the capacity to teach these talents, and they became usable by the character the moment the item was assigned. Items taught different characters varied abilities. Much like Final Fantasy IV, each hero in 9 was clearly intended for a particular job. Their personal traits reflected these roles. Some were shared by multiple characters, and some were unique. In addition, not all the abilities could be active at once, allowing the player to be more or less effective by assembling the proper combination of attributes for each upcoming task. The limit break concept from 7 made a comeback when party members entered trance mode by reaching the end of their damage bar. Zidane was the only warrior who could choose from a list of attacks while tranced, as the others received a brief boost, strengthening their attack power or allowing them to act more than once. Unlike limit breaks, these bonuses couldn't be saved and carried over to another encounter. Summons were dubbed Eidolons in 9, and their callers originated from a lost village, similar to Rydia's hometown in 4. Replicating 8's grid-based card diversion, 9 let you challenge multiple characters to a bout of Tetramaster. Unlike 8, the game within a game became a necessary objective that pit you against the sport's champion, Sailor Aeryn. After you became the new Tetramaster, Aaron was revealed as the pilot of your first airship. IX also introduced the Final Fantasy audience to a strange internet support system called Play Online. Originally conceived to interact with Final Fantasy X, Play Online developed into an online add-on for Brady Games' strategy guide. This proved to be a poorly thought-out idea. Many fans that purchased it felt cheated because of the lack of printed information. Today, Play Online serves as the communication hub for Square's internet services, including Final Fantasy XI and Tetramaster. Although IX received critical acclaim, it was faced with mixed feelings from fans. While elder players looked upon it with warm nostalgia, the younger set simply didn't get it. Nevertheless, Sakaguchi has stated several times that Final Fantasy IX is his personal favorite. Join us next week when the faces of Square's fantasies are finally given a voice.
You understand me?
And the only direct console sequel in the franchise makes its mark. With Sakaguchi's side project sliding into the 9th slot, the original successor to Final Fantasy VIII was pushed to the PlayStation 2, which launched 3 months before 9 in Japan. Eager to take full advantage of improved technology, Square spent $32 million on its next project, assembling the talents of over 100 writers, coders, and artists. Most of the earlier fantasies focused on a European style of architecture and topography, with 7 and 8 weaving in elements of modern technology and Japanese steampunk. When growing its new world, Square sought influence from the islands of Southeast Asia, specifically near the regions of Thailand and the South Pacific. Water would play a dominant role in the setting and story of Spira, a sun-drenched paradise with beauty gamers had never experienced. Final Fantasy X was released in Japan on July 19, 2001. It washed up on our shores just in time for Christmas. It was directed by Motomu Toriyama, who had worked as an event planner on 7 and 8. Katase and Sakaguchi supervised via producer roles. Tetsuya Nomura returned to design the characters, and Nobuo Uematsu composed his 10th series score, but received additional assistance for the first time. The story began and ended in Zanarkand, a tropic metropolis unaware of its imminent destruction. Titus, a professional blitzball athlete, was barely saved from the massacre by his mentor, Auron. The two warped to the world of Spira, where Titus learned the city he called home had been destroyed 1,000 years earlier. His quest for answers led him to discover an ancient pilgrimage that would shake the ground of his very existence. This fish-out-of-water tale was unconventional for the franchise. As an outsider, Titus learned everything that was known about Spira directly, without any need for creative exposition. The story also stood out by establishing a clear geographic endpoint fairly early on in the narrative, unfolding its secrets as you trekked along the path toward its unavoidable conclusion. This prophetic journey's aim was to guide and protect the summoner Yuna, a caller of sacred spirits now called Aeons, whose power came from human souls called Faith. Yuna's multiple guardians included Waka, a beach-bound blitzball captain, Kimari, a Ronso outcast of few words, Lulu, an unforgiving black mage, and Riku, a spunky teenage thief who was Titus's first contact with Inspira. The in-game character models were pleasantly detailed, with facial expressions their predecessors only dreamed of. But their colorful attitudes were defined by another franchise breakthrough:
Quiet!
voice acting.
You have profaned and subverted a 1,000-year-old tradition. Do you realize what you've done?
Their dialogue was penned by Kazushige Nojima, who also wrote Final Fantasy VII and VIII. Not every line was spoken, as subtitles were used for minor non-playable characters, but the central heroes and villains were all cast with both English and Japanese voice actors, bringing their vocal cords to life. The inclusion created numerous development hiccups, such as characters' lips mouthing one language but speaking another.
Take your time.
But the addition was an ambitious and crucial step forward. A priest and maester named Seymour Guado went against the beliefs of his nation and his religion in a quest to save the world from suffering by killing everyone on the planet. To do this, he planned to possess a colossal whale monster named Sin that rose from the depths of the ocean and decimated entire villages. The role of all summoners was to build their strength and family of Aeons to eventually confront Sin in the ruins of Zanarkand. But Sin had and would return multiple times, leaving Titus and his newfound friends to search for a way to end the destructive cycle and abolish Sin once and for all. Cid appeared as Riku's father and the leader of the Albed, a roguish lower-class race. He gave the party access to the Fahrenheit, only there was no free flying in 10. For the first time, the overworld that had become a series standard vanished, leaving one continuous world map to pass through. While many missed running across open plains and rocketing their ships over oceans and mountains, the alternate perspective needed to disappear so developers could replace another last-generation trick: pre-rendered backgrounds. Every outdoor environment in Final Fantasy X was rendered in real-time 3D, making the gorgeous surroundings stunningly tangible. You had no camera control, but the view would glide along with your movements in numerous directions. Fights were still random while traveling, but many boss encounters began with a flashy transition that blended the angle from the overworld into the brand new battle window. Fights in Final Fantasy X left active time and introduced the conditional turn-based battle. You now had all the time in the world to assign each move, and the order both sides would act in was listed in 8 vertical blocks on the right of the screen. Additionally, a tip ticker scrolled vital information about each target on the top, indicating weaknesses and possible strategies. This had been previously possible as an ability or spell, but never as a tool built into the display. Only 3 people filled the formation, and the other 4 waited in the wings. You could pull them in and out at will, and they gained experience based on their involvement in each bout. If you didn't use them, they didn't level. Overdrives were the new limit break. Like before, they became available when a meter reached its full capacity. Their attacks varied per character, and like Final Fantasy VIII, many required brief bits of timed controller inputs, making use of the PS2's dual analog sticks. The big difference in 10 was the ability to adjust the modes of each character's overdrives, specifically identifying the circumstances that caused the meter to fill. Yuna was the only mage who could use summon magic, and instead of her callings tearing up the battlefield and fading away, they joined the party in exchange for the other 2 members. By your side, they drew the enemy's attacks and acted on a list of available abilities. They had a health meter for the first time, and could fall in battle, only to be resummoned for another fight. 10's leveling system was a labyrinth of attribute plots called the Sphere Grid. As characters powered up, they gained ability points versus experience. When they achieved a new sphere level, they could use any of the glowing orbs they found in their travels by assigning them to any node that opened up. This turned the typically stationary advancement method into a game itself, one that allowed you to go against the grain and adjust anyone's abilities to your liking. Only 2 equipment spaces were allotted to each character, one for weapon, one for armor. But once the crafty Riku joined your party, she could customize your arsenal. Not every item could be upgraded, but the underdeveloped ones gained new abilities and often a new name when you combined them with items like marbles, spheres, and potions. The mandatory minigame in 10 was Titus and Wakka's favorite pastime, Blitzball, a form of underwater rugby. After a glimpse of the professional sport in one of the opening movies, you went for the championship with the Besaid Aurochs, a good-hearted crew that had lost their first match in the tournament 10 years running. Playing involved both real-time movement and turn-based combat, and once the cup was yours, you could return to the stadium whenever you wanted another challenge. As with many games in the series, Final Fantasy X was adored by some and disliked by others. Fans praised the multifaceted storyline and outstanding graphics. Skeptics detested the flawed sphere system and sometimes unbearable voiceover performances.
Well...
But rain or shine, few missed out on the series' first installment on Sony's second system. Final Fantasy X sold close to 2 million units in 4 days. It became the first PlayStation 2 game to break that mark, and eventually sold twice that much. It's among the top 20 best-selling console games of all time, and considered one of the best role-playing games on the platform. Square seized this profitable opportunity and finally decided to release a direct sequel to a game in the numbered series. Development began in 2002 with essentially the same design staff, only at 1/3 the size. With the majority of locations and character models being reused from the first game, it took half the time to create. All Final Fantasies have a happy ending, giving X-2 the most energetic opening fans had ever seen.
What can I do for you?
Final Fantasy X-2 was released in Japan on March 13, 2003, about 2 years after the release of X. It eventually toured America in November. Since the major crisis in X was solved, the atmosphere of the world had a brighter, happier feel. Rather than drawing on reverent Japanese mythology, the team used popular culture, anime, and manga for inspiration. As such, the sound of the game needed to be changed as well. Noriko Matsuda and Takahito Eguchi, known for their work on The Bouncer, took over for Uematsu. X-2 continued the story 2 years later, focusing on Yuna and the Gullwings, a group of ragtag sphere hunters scoring all kinds of adventure in the new Eternally Calm Spira. The Gullwings were comprised of many familiar faces from X, and the crew traveled around the world in Cid's Celsius, making X-2 the first Final Fantasy to give you airship access from the outset. Sharing the field work with Yuna was her boisterous cousin Riku and the stolid newcomer Pain. After continually outsmarting their rivals, the LeBlanc Syndicate, Yuna and the girls eventually stumbled across a sphere that contained some startling information. Unsure if the images were real, the Gullwings set off to uncover the truth and hopefully find Yuna's lost love. Along the way, they encountered many old friends, as well as some eccentric new faces. In the 2 years since Sin was defeated, many new groups had risen to power. Among these, the followers of New Yevon had taken back the holy city of Bavel under the judgment of the Praetor Baralai. The Youth League had rallied many familiar troops behind the banner of the mysterious Maven Nuge, and the charismatic Albed entrepreneur Gippel got you started digging in the desert. Although X-2 drew from a number of modern influences, the combat system relied once again on a Final Fantasy classic, job switching. However, jobs were given a fabulous makeover with the addition of dress spheres and garment grids. Garment grids were similar to very small sphere grids with 2 to 6 empty nodes. Dress spheres contained the powers of the various jobs that could be placed on the garment grids. Once equipped, the girls could freely switch between any of the dress spheres on the grid. They could only be changed with adjacent spheres, and much like the previous sphere system, passing through different gates unlocked certain temporary powers. The biggest bonus was that outfits could be changed in battle at any time, for the use of only one ability or the remainder of the fight. This made up for the lack of any additional party members beyond Yuna's Angels by allowing truly masterful characters to shine in a number of jobs. X-2 featured several classic classes such as Warrior, Black Mage, White Mage, and Thief. It expanded the jobs Dark Knight, Gun Mage, Berserker, and Trainer, and took some liberal departures like Gunner, Songstress, and Lady Luck. Each individual dress sphere earned skills like many other job-based installments with ability points. In addition to the integration of dress spheres, X-2 also featured a mission-based progression system, rather than the traditional linear path. Although there was a main story to follow, players were given the choice to delve into more or less of it by choosing several tasks that inched the plot along or provided some other insight on the updated world of Spira. For the most part, the choices Yuna made were irreversible and had a strong impact on later parts of the story, both positive and negative. A large percentage of the game itself didn't adhere to the central plotline, which the player may have missed entirely if their focus was only on following the story. One of the most difficult decisions Yuna made early on was whether or not to side with the Youth League or New Yevon. Multiple endings were also possible depending on the percentage of the game completed. Attaining 100% prompted a bonus ending. When you reached the finale, you had the chance to start over with experienced plus characters that took with them all the items, abilities, and dress fears that you had at the previous conclusion. Only round 2 dropped the girls back to level 1. Despite the drastic tonal change, 10-2 still had its share of notables. It was, and is, the only game of the core 3D incarnations that featured job switching, as well as the only game in the entire series that allowed you to swap them completely on the fly. In addition, 10-2 is the only direct console sequel in the franchise that featured faces from the original, as well as an all-female cast of playable characters. Join us next week for the only chapter in our 13-part Final Fantasy retrospective in HD. In Part 8, Square brings its community together to journey side by side. The 11th massively multiplayer installment would connect 3 platforms, 12 countries, and let the legions of fans tell their own story online.